So today I'll be talking to you about generalization, and generalization is a fundamental ability both in learning language, learning to communicate, but it's also an important step in the development of abstract thought. And the study I'd like to discuss with you today is a study in which we investigated children's solving strategies when they are generalizing relational nouns. And to do that, we've done an eye tracking analysis. So in a situation where children are trying to use a relational noun and use it for something new, and we're going to be following their eye movements throughout their task whilst they're doing that. And this is work I've been doing so in France, and as you said, Margarita, with Jean-Pierre Thibault and Arnaud Witt. Now, generalization is the ability to use something that you've already learned and use it in a new situation, and even in a more general situation. So that can be the case for a technique that you've learned, or a thought that a piece of reasoning that you've had on something and that you're then transferring, generalizing to a new situation, or it can be with words. And I am working on word generalization. And so that's the ability, for example, to learn the word apple when you're a young child. So this is in the case of children that are learning to talk, or are still learning to talk. So maybe from 2 to 5 years old. And it's the case where you learn an apple because you're given an apple, for example, and the child is told it's an apple, either because his mother or his father has pointed to an apple in a picture book, for example. That's often what happens when children are learning to talk, learning new words. They're shown one apple in a book, and a parent points and said, "Oh, look, this is an apple." Or if a parent is pointing to an apple on an apple tree. So children will encounter the word apple and will see a limited number of apples. And progressively, they'll learn that this word goes with that item, that object that they've seen in their environment. And once they've remembered this word apple, they might end up in a situation which becomes slightly more difficult, because they could, for example, want to ask for an apple in this fruit bowl, or they might even be asked by somebody to pick an apple out of this fruit bowl. In that case, they'd have to work out which one of these pieces of fruit in this basket is an apple, select it, and continue from there. And that's slightly more difficult. Now, it's more difficult because, for example, a child would have to work out that this is an apple. Even it looks very similar to the apple they may have learned the word apple from, but it's not exactly the same, and it's an apple that they have never seen before. So they have to work out that this one is an apple, but this one isn't, even though it looks very similar as well. Now, it's not an apple because we know it has properties, intersect properties, taxonomic properties that make it an orange rather than an apple. But the child might also have to work out that this one can be called an apple and not the one underneath, not the orange, even though it looks more dissimilar to the apple he learnt from compared to the orange. So this is where children might start. They have to actually really understand what the word is referring to. And in this case, the word isn't referring just to some superficial perceptual aspects of the piece of fruit, but actually to its properties and to its nature, you could say. Now, this brings me to talk slightly about categories and categorization, because that's actually what is it's part of what a child will need to understand to get this generalization task correct. Now, categories, to make a category, you have to group items together. It's a very informal definition, but it's just to get an understanding of what might be happening. Children have to group items together that go together. But that's where it gets difficult, because lots of items, especially in this situation, for example, could be put together because they go together. In front of these shapes, you could associate the shapes by color. You could put all the red shapes together, or you could associate the shapes by shape. So you'd put all the squares together and all the circles together, or it could even be by size. So if you didn't have a word, for example, if you didn't have a name, if you weren't given the categorization rule, you'd be able to categorize these different objects in at least 3 different ways. And we don't categorize randomly in our environment, because we live in society, and categories have already been limited. The boundaries of the categories have already been fixed by conventions and by society, also by what we know of science and what we know of object properties. That's how our society fixes categories. And the categories we use in everyday life and to understand the environment around us also have words associated to them, and very fixed rules. The rules are not, categories are not built on perceptive similarities, they're built on taxonomic scientific rules about items' properties. So, for example, if you were given all these objects and you were asked to categorize, it is very likely that if you were asked to draw the boundary dividing these items into two categories, you would draw this boundary. Because on one side you've got Christmas decorations and on the other side you've got what we call apples. Now, of course, that's because we have already classified these objects and we have words for these objects. But you could have also have drawn this boundary and had the red and sort of yellowy green ones underneath. Or you could have even had more than one boundary. You could have had two boundaries if you were classifying by color and by shape. Now, of course, everybody would go for this one because it's already been fixed for us. Language has already fixed these categories, and we've learnt language, we've acquired language, and we master language quite well, and that's fixed the way we perceive things. And so it now seems obvious that the boundary should be there and not horizontally. But let's come back to what I was saying at the beginning. I'm going to be talking about situations where children have a word and have to generalize it to a new situation. And we know from previous studies, especially Gentner's studies, that children have difficulty in such a task because they tend to go for objects that look the same. So 4-year-olds will go for an object, will match, if they're given the apple up here and they're told it's a dachs and they are asked to choose another dachs between the Christmas decoration and the banana, they'll actually mostly go for the Christmas decoration because it looks the same and they're attracted to this item because it has perceptive similarities with the apple. Unless you give them two apples to compare from, and in that case, they'll be able to switch over and choose this taxonomically related item, the one that is from the same category and would have the same name. So comparison helps children generalize correctly. Now, so far, I've only talked about nouns, objects and nouns, but this sort of generalization task can also be done for what we call relational nouns. Now, relational nouns are words that qualify not the object itself, but the relation between two objects. For example, the relation of one object cutting, one entity cutting something else. And in this case, if you look at all these different situations, you're always qualifying the same relation. The relational noun is always cutter, for example, or cutter for. So you're always trying to qualify the same relation. You're always qualifying the same relation, but you're in very different situations, and you can see from these pictures that you're in situations where the objects themselves are very different and don't look alike at all. The knife, the pair of scissors, and the lawnmower or the motocultor don't look the same at all. But they are all cutting something, and what they are cutting does not look the same at all either. The bread, the grass, and the paper all look very different. So this has sort of two implications. First of all, relational nouns are slightly more difficult to learn. Well, they're learnt later for children. Children use relational nouns and learn relational nouns slightly later than nouns, probably because you're referring to the relation, this abstract relation, not the objects themselves. So you have to learn that you're not referring to the object properties, but to the relation. And you have to work out that in all these different situations, that before you've learned the relation, you can't see what the link between them is. So the number of occurrences you might have to have, the number of times you might have to encounter the relation to cut or the verb to cut, in that case, might be more. You might have to have more occurrences than in the case of a noun. And as you heard, I switched over to verbs just then because this idea of characterizing a relation between two items, it's the case for relational nouns, but it also could be the case for verbs. The problem is the same with verbs. A verb, for example, to fly can be for lots of different objects, and it's not the object itself that you're qualifying, it's not the relation, the action. So here we're working on relational nouns, but it's something that you could do with verbs as well. And in the case of relational noun, comparison has also been shown to help children generalize the relational noun correctly. Oh, and I told you there were two implications. So the first one was that children will take longer to learn these relational nouns. But the second implication is that once they've understood the concept of a relational noun, and they've understood how it is embedded in language and in sentences, they can understand when they're given a sentence with a relational noun that the word that they hear is referring to the relation and not the object. So once they've worked out what a relational noun is, they're sort of no longer caught up in the difficulties with perception that I showed you earlier. They're slightly more independent of the resemblances between objects and between the items they're working with. So comparison has been shown to help children generalize these relational nouns as well. And a relational noun generalization task would look like this one. So you'd have two pairs over here, because we're in a comparison situation. So it's two pairs instead of one pair, from which the child can learn the targeted relation, the relation that the trial is targeting. We can give these items names. The one that is going to come and cut the other can be called the operator, and the one that is being cut will be called the entity. So you have two pairs, we can call them learning pairs, in which there's an operator and an entity. And children, for example, will be shown this, and you could tell them the saw is the booksy for the log, and the shears are the booksy for the hedge. So from a sentence like this, children, here we'll be working with 5-year-olds, 5-year-olds, even younger children, understand that we're talking about the relation because of the way the sentence is built and because of the way we're giving this fake relational noun. And so children are shown these items, and at the same time they can be shown over here on the other side what we might call the generalization domain, a target entity that they have to find a match for. So they have to find the item that can be the operator, so the target operator for this entity. And in this case, the target operator will be this relational match, because that's the one that has the same relational link with this target entity. So children will be asked which one of these three, or which one of these is the booksy for the grass, and a correct answer would be pointing to this relational match. Now, what we've tried to investigate is which strategies do children use in novel relational noun generalization tasks. So we know that children use comparisons. We know that from a certain age they go for this relational match, but we want to know what they're actually doing, which strategies they are doing to succeed in this generalization task. Now we know at least two things, that they're comparing at first, and that then they're trying to find a match. That's sort of where you can start from. At the beginning, they're over here, learning, trying to understand the targeted relation, and then they have to find a match. And we think that they'll be comparing these different pairs. So what we'll do to try and understand these strategies is we'll take the meaningful switches between items, and we'll try and see which meaningful switches they're doing. I say meaningful switches because there are some switches that we've checked aren't meaningful, but that we're not going to talk about here because they don't correspond to something conceptually. But for example, here at the beginning of the task, so we're expecting children to compare, and we could, for example, expect them to have eye movements to switch from the entity to an operator, or back from the operator to an entity inside the same pair. So children might be switching between items of a learning pair to try and understand what relation is being given in the task, what booksy means. Or they could be comparing these learning pairs between each other. And so in that case, they might be aligning equivalent items, so aligning both entities together or aligning the operators together. So at the beginning of the task, we're expecting either switches between items of the same pair, these light yellow ones, or switches that align equivalent items from different pairs, so these orange ones. They could be doing either of these. And then we know that children will move on to try and find a solution, try and find a match for this target entity. And here I'm going to talk about two different possibilities inspired from the alignment first strategy that was suggested by Markman and Gentner, or the projection first strategy, which was suggested and described by Hummel and Holyoake. So from these different hypotheses in the literature, there could be two different ways that children might work towards the solution. So first of all, what might they be doing if they're following something like the projection first strategy? What might they be doing if they're trying to project into the generalization domain what they've extracted from the learning domain? Well, if they're projecting, they'll be moving over to the generalization side here, and they'll be proceeding with switches between items in the generalization domain. But if they've projected from the learning domain, they'll be staying in the generalization domain and making either switches between the target entity and any one of the different options, and back and forth, of course, or they might be comparing the different options between them. Here on the side, you've got arrows that can show that. So these are different switches that might reflect that children are using a strategy that is more a projective strategy. Then again, they might be doing something that is more an alignment way of seeing things. They might be trying to understand or align items from the learning domain and equivalent items that have the same status in the generalization domain. So here, for example, they might be aligning one of the learning entities or either of the learning entities with the target entity, because they have the same status, they're both the entity. And I'll just, instead of having all these arrows everywhere, we'll just summarize that by this big green arrow. So that would be a switch from entity to entity, so from the learning entity to the generalization entity. Or they might be switching from one or either of the operators to the target operator, the relational match, or from the operators to the other options. So these might be the switches that they'd be using if they're trying to align learning items with generalization items. And if that alignment process from learning to generalization is the way they're finding the solution, then it might translate with these sort of switches once we analyze the eye tracking data. So just to summarize that before I move on to the analysis, so they'll be doing either inside the same pair switches or between pair switches at learning. And children will be doing either switches between generalization items, so staying in the generalization domain, or they might be making switches that align equivalent items in the learning domain and the generalization domain. So that's what we were looking to analyze in our data analysis. So just briefly, to do that, we tested 76 5-year-olds. We manipulated the distance of these generalization items compared to the learning items to have near items and distant items, because that's known to affect generalization performances, so it may affect generalization strategies. We controlled the distance, the conceptual distance between the learning pairs over here. We controlled also the trial order, the item positions. And something that was rather important that we controlled was the layout. Here I've shown you something that is left to right, but we had 4 different layouts especially to control reading distance. No, not distance, sorry. We didn't want it all to be left to right. We also had right to left, and we also had top to bottom. So we had 4 different layouts to make sure that the strategies we were looking at were the strategies inducted by the task, and not just a sort of reading way of looking at the task. To analyze the data, we analyzed switches and fixation times. I'm just going to talk about switches today, and we cut the data we collected data for each trial and we cut the data into 3 equal time slices. So when I'll show you the data, you'll see that I'm talking about the data at the beginning, in the middle, at the end of the task each time. That was to get an idea of how the strategy evolves over time, and to get an idea of the temporal dynamics of the strategy over time. So here we just checked the percentage of correct answers. Now children here, they're 5-year-olds, they're doing pretty well. They're actually, you don't get much better than that. So you might even say they're doing too well. But 5-year-olds here are at 60% of correct answers, an average of 60% correct answers. And there is no difference between near and distant generalization, probably because they're doing really well. So further on, I checked that generalization distance doesn't affect strategies, it doesn't. So I'm going to present the eye tracking analysis without talking about generalization distance. Here you can see, this is the results we got when we analyzed switches at learning. So down over here, you can see that at the beginning and in the middle of the task, there were many switches between items of a same pair. So here they're the yellow ones, and few switches between pairs. So few switches aligning items from a same pair, and few switches in both cases at the end of the trial, because as the trial moves along, as time goes through, children actually move over to the generalization side to try, so they go from comparing, learning, to trying to find the solution. And this is what comes out for the analysis of the generalization switches. So as you can see with the colors, there are more and more switches that translate looking for a solution as we go along. And from the very beginning, there are a few switches between the target entity and the different options. So over here in the generalization domain. And as we move along to the end, there are more and more of these switches inside the generalization domain, and more switches between the target entity and the relational match. Because here I'm showing you the analysis just on correct answers. That's why at the end, children are switching to and between the target entity and the relational match. And as you can see, maybe at the beginning, at the middle, or at the end, there are very few switches that translate alignment between equivalent items in the learning and in the generalization domain. So this sort of brings us to conclude that our results support a projection first. They support more a projection first model. Children are working inside the learning domain, probably to extract the targeted relation. That's probably why they're switching between the entity and the operator, trying to understand what relation links these two items. And then they move on. They don't switch from learning to generalization domains much, probably only just to get over here. Maybe they come back to check, but really the switches that you can see that go from the learning to the generalization domain are probably just the ones that they need to actually move over to the generalization domain. And then over here, they're working inside this domain, probably projecting the relation that they've extracted at the beginning and in search of a solution. Now, I'm going to stop there, and maybe we can discuss, or I can extend the discussion a little bit whilst we're talking, but I'll stop there for now and open up to questions if you have any.